Center for Cancer and Blood Disorders at CCMC and an assistant professor of pediatrics at UConn School of Medicine. And I'd like to welcome Dr. Rob Ketter, developmental and behavioral pediatrics, CCMC, and he's an assistant professor of pediatrics at UConn School of Medicine. And we also have some young people here with us this evening. Jack is here with Whiteson, along with Kiara Bailiff and Alicia Bailiff. And I hope I did not mess up anyone's names, but if so, thank you just so much for being here. Howard, I'd like to turn it over to you so you can give a brief introduction of yourself and to kind of frame what we're trying to, our issue here this evening.
Sure. I got to shut off my phone though.
And that's a great queuing up for our conversation.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Representative Exum, and we really appreciate you inviting us to participate in this series of conversations about mental health and children's mental health. And we also are very grateful for the leadership that you're providing statewide in advancing children's mental health in the state of Connecticut. So thank you for that. As you know, Connecticut Children's is the only independent children's hospital in the state of Connecticut. And we are very much dedicated to integrating both emotional health with our physical health and providing comprehensive care to kids. You know, and in this time, technology and social media has been a lifesaver for many of us, but for many, it's also been a huge source of concern. Access to and reliance on social media presents unique challenges to those of us responsible for the care, health, and safety of children. You know, over the last year and a half, 2 years, we've been able to successfully use telemedicine to bring healthcare to people during this pandemic who otherwise would not have access to seeing their doctors or their therapists. Kids have been experiencing remote learning for the first time, probably ever, and it's been a lifesaver for many, but for many, it's represented a real serious challenge. We are privileged tonight to really have a bunch of, two of our main experts from Connecticut Children's, along with a group of younger adults with lived experience in social media, to really engage us in a conversation about the impact social media has on the developing brain of children and on the emotional health of children, and how we as caretakers, as parents, as teachers, perhaps as sports coaches, can be sensitive to the impact that social media is having on children and be alert to the signs that it might be interfering or impacting on the children's health and welfare. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Lauren Airvolta and Dr. Rob Ketter. Dr. Volter, I think you've introduced her. She's a neuropsychologist and one of our finest at Connecticut Children's. And Rob Ketter is one of our leading developmental pediatricians who does a tremendous amount of work, not only in treating children, but interfacing with schools and helping schools and teachers understand how to best manage children. So with no further ado, Rob, I think you're the first one up.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having us. I am one of your friendly neighborhood developmental and behavioral pediatricians. If you're not familiar with who or what we are as a specialty, my goal is I work with children with and without disabilities to help kind of parents and schools and even the child themselves kind of understand who they are for strengths and weaknesses. We try to help every kid reach the best of their potential. So we work with everyone, and a lot of the kids that I work with all have lots of things to do with screen time and media. So what we wanted to do was talk about social media and children's mental health, and we're going to do that in two ways. We're going to talk a little bit about screen time in general, because social media is a part of screen time. And then we're going to focus a little bit on social media. And then we're going to talk a little bit more about screen time in general, because sometimes the research is hard to pull apart the two things. So we'll kind of move in that direction. So neither of us have any disclosures, but first we're going to start with screen time. So kind of screen time in general, it's really important to pay attention to this as a historical thing because it's how quick technology is moving. We've seen a big shift in how technology comes up. So like we've gone from cathode ray televisions to now like super high definition computers that are in everyone's pocket. And as we've moved away from what we used to call traditional media like television, radio, and magazines, now there's digital media, things like smartphones, apps, streaming content, user posted content, which is so very different than even just a decade ago about how much stuff is put up on the internet, like Reddit or Wikipedia or Facebook and social media. So what happened is we moved away from like a few sources where like once upon a time, before even I was born, there were like 4 channels and you watched what was on 4 channels on a schedule. And then over time there became things. And then we learned to master that with like TiVo, and you could record things. And yes, I'm old, I said TiVo, right? But we could record things. But now it's like whatever you want, when you want, on your own schedule. So there's so much more content that's on demand. And really what we've seen too is this has been a shift in how kids and teens are processing information, because we went from a time where kids were doing a lot more content creation to now content curation, meaning you're keeping track of things, you're posting things that are meaningful to you and your soul on Instagram and stuff, but not necessarily creating your own content. That's not everyone, but as a general trend and shift. Some things to think about too is technology has gotten so potent that content itself is more immersive. Like I'm old enough to remember this as a video game when I was younger, right? Like really low definition, 8-bit, but now stuff is so realistic that you can see things in super high def, right? It's meant to be immersive. And with that being so immersive, we also have to remember that it's not just like how pretty it looks, but it is intentionally designed to keep people coming back for more. And this is where we think about things like algorithms and intentional design. So once upon a time, if you're old enough, you remember a thing called an arcade where you got to go and like put a quarter in, maybe just a quarter, and play a game like Pinball or Rampage, or I remember Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, the arcade game, and X-Men, the arcade game. I will swear by those for my entire childhood. They were amazing, right? But that was, you had to go and you had to bring money. But now those are obsolete because people have arcades in their pocket, and we've changed the way that those transactions work, right? There it was play again and put in another quarter, but now it's play and you could wait, or you could buy in-game currency through what we call microtransactions and try to have things happen quicker in a game that you're playing on your phone. And another danger here is that it's not just that you're actively taking a quarter and putting it in, that you're buying fake currency with real currency and then spending in-game currency. So all of a sudden you're completely dissociated from like, how much money are you actually spending, right? Like there's a fun new Pokemon game out that kids are playing, but like to get a costume for a character in the real world, that could cost $40, right? For a digital costume for a character. So things are designed in a way to get you to want to do stuff. So we have to remember that when it comes to social media, YouTube, everything, they're there to generate revenue, and that revenue is usually through ads. So even if it's not a game, they use things like algorithms to keep you hooked. And that's where it comes down to, like, you know, your YouTube feed showing you all the videos that you want to watch because it knows who you are. So if you're like me and you have funny burb videos, because apparently birds don't spell birds on YouTube with a D, it's burbs, B-I-R-B-S, right? Like you find all those fun videos and it knows that you like them and it starts showing you more and more. Why? Because it's designed to keep you to click, to keep you to show you other ads and other things. So content itself is focusing and it's becoming more targeted. Advertising when I was a young child was like the Toys R Us catalog. And when that came out, it was like, ooh, I'm excited. I'm going to see what new things there are. But now, right, like people watch advertisements. There are certain content creators, so to speak, who are actually there because they're funded by companies to push out things. So you have your influencers. And then on top of that, the way that web design works with things like cookies, right? How is it that certain social media apps know that you want things, right? How is it that Facebook knows that I like children's books because I work with children at work, that I like mysteries, and that I like board games because it's like, hey, do you want to kickstart this pop-up board game book that's themed as a murder mystery? And I was like, wow, you know the intersection of all of my things, right? But it's because we have the technology where we're sharing data, and that data is attached to things like our emails, our usernames, phone numbers, and all of that. What we've also seen too is that even just opening an account like with Instagram or some of the other social media influencers, that teens are solicited for ads and other things like in your inbox right away just from starting it, because that data is being traded and used among others. So we want to pay attention to how is screen time being used. Long story short, we went from like television becoming like a real thing in 1947 to all of a sudden YouTube like first popping up in 2005, but it didn't really become a thing until 2009. And then all of a sudden we have 2019 with this last set of data that we've gone to like almost 90% of 15-year-olds have a smartphone, right? And the first iPhone, the majorly first well-known smartphone that we think of, right, only came out like 12 years prior in 2007. So, you know, we're seeing a big shift from when back in the 1970s, a child first watched television at 4 years old. Now in 2000 teens, we're seeing that kids first start having screen time at 4 months old. So digital technology is here and it's become so ingrained into who we are. It's part of how we're paying attention to how things are being used. Screen time is a huge part. So this is a part of the Common Sense Census, which is a really cool nonprofit group that puts out really nice data. But when they looked at tweens, pre-teenagers, they were spending on average 4 hours to 5 hours of time on screen time a day. But we're seeing that teens are spending anywhere above 7 hours a day of screen time. And we also see different levels of disparity and socioeconomic differences in that too. So there's a whole deep dive that we could do into this data. What we're also seeing too is that just even over the course of a 4-year period, smartphone ownership is still going up, even with the youngest tweens. So this is showing like, right, as we see kids who are moving across the age portion from 8 to 18, right, that in 2015, 18-year-olds, 77% had a smartphone, but by now, 91% of teenagers hitting 18 have a smartphone. So some other key take-home points that we've seen, we know that things like streaming content has more than doubled. This includes things like Netflix and Hulu and other online streaming sources, but also content and user-created things like TikTok and YouTube. We know that the total time for social media has remained steady, but we're seeing that kids are using it at younger and younger ages. So that's something that's really important, because even if you identify as like a 17-year-old now, your 11-year-old sibling is getting introduced content at a much younger age than you did. We know that the majority of kids are not creating their own content, but like asterisk hashtag, that was pre-TikTok data. I'm curious to see how that changes now, because everybody's making TikTok stuff and putting it out there. We also know that there are gender associations and differences in how it's used, that boys tend to spend more time with computer and video games, whereas girls seem to be using more music and social media, but that does change a little bit over time. What we are seeing though is that as tech rises, we're seeing a decrease in teens identifying that they like reading as something fun or pleasurable. And this is another data piece that a lot of kids are saying that their parents have no idea what they're doing, right? So something really important, right, is how do we let kids out into the world physically, but also digitally? So really quick on screen time and child development, you might be thinking, so how does this media influence how we grow and learn as kids? Well, a couple of ways. There's something called social learning, which is how we role model, like we see something, we copy something. That's a lot of influencer phenomena when it comes to social media. There's also direct information or misinformation, where you might see a celebrity or somebody put out something on their social media account, and it could be true or not true, but not everyone takes things at face value or does take it at face value. There's also messaging and attributions of social value. meaning that we might give certain gravity or preference to certain behaviors or traits or certain things, right? If all of a sudden something starts trending, it means that we're assigning a social or societal value to that. How does that change how your thoughts and your biases could be driven? And then two other parts, there's positive and negative reinforcement, right? And that's kind of very meta in the sense of like, what do you get out of when you're playing something? Are you getting a benefit from playing a game or going on social media? Is it helping you feel better on a behavioral place or on an emotional place? Or is it actually making you feel worse? And then there's also the natural consequences of time management. Media and social media is meant to eat at your time, and time is one of the precious things we have. There are only 24 hours in a day. So if we see that that screen time is going up, what's it competing with? Is it competing with homework? Is it competing with sleep? Is it competing with exercise? Is it competing with your ability to like talk with a friend in real life? Now, fortunately, with the pandemic, right, it has kept us to be able to chat and talk and keep up with one another. But we're seeing those differences as we're trying to come back into the new normal of reintegrating with schools and in a vaccine-based era. So because screen time's here, it's not an issue of quantity as much because time is there. The American Academy of Pediatrics said, let's not focus on how much screen time in a day. Let's focus on the quality of the screen time. So this is where I'm asking, you are what you eat. You could have a nice donut that's really high quality, or you could have a lot of donuts that might be just like plain old donuts, but it's about how you want to allocate how much you're eating and how you want to use your calories for the day. Some things are created to be good. So this was when we look at stuff, right? There are things like educational apps and games that are out there and marketed, but not all of them are actually real. Some commercial apps are there to be helpful, but not all are designed by people who are actual early childhood specialists or educators themselves. And we have to remember that games are designed for maximum engagement. I'm going to make myself sound old, but I remember when I was a child and I got to go to the store to go to this place called Electronics Boutique. I'm old. And I would get a video game for like my 8th or 9th birthday. My favorite thing was like opening it in the car and pulling out the instruction manual and reading the instruction manual in the car because I had pictures and I would learn about the game. For all of you who play games, when's the last time a game came with a physical instruction manual, right? Games are now designed in a way where you don't even appreciate that the game's teaching you because it's so well intentionally designed that it's teaching you how to play the game as it levels up and makes progress. But it's also meant to be addictive because like, oh, you just finished one objective, here are 3 more. You can go to the next thing, right? And this explains why it can create tantrums or withdrawal-like behaviors because, right, it's hitting that pleasure part of your brain where you're like, this is cool, this is cool, this is cool. And like trying to pull away from that is hard. But it's also why certain things are effective. Like if you're a kid who likes to play Minecraft or something like that, right? Why do loot boxes work? Because it's the next thing and it's designed intentionally to get you to go back in and check. So we also know that the quality of media itself is designed in certain ways. There was this one big study, well, not big study, but a study a few years ago that looked at, right, how are kids affected by certain shows? And they looked at shows like Caillou, which were kind of slow paced, shows like SpongeBob, which were really fast paced. And then they gave kids like some opportunities to just sit in color. And surprise, the kids who sat in color, when they did little tests to see how they could organize themselves and pay attention and focus on tasks, did about the same as the kids who watched the slow paced show. But kids who watched the really fast paced, high energetic show that was like thing, overstimulating, really struggled with organization and executive function on testing right afterwards. So, this is where it's really important. If you want to be a nerd like me, this is why I love like some of my good Studio Ghibli films, like Kiki's Delivery Service, where it's like nice and slow paced. And you're like, oh, let me see a scene of the beach animated versus something that's like just really in your face and intense, right? Because it helps push stuff, but it also hurts our ability to focus. So, other things to think about, right? You are what you eat. There's good quality stuff. So there is good, high quality early childhood educational programming. There's opportunities for social media to do social connection, civic engagement like this, right? Sociocultural tolerance and learning about things. But then there's also bad things that can happen. Things like, is media hurting your ability to connect with other family members? Is it something that's disguised as educational, but it's really just commercial and it's trying to get you to part with money? Are there privacy issues? Are there violence issues? Is it affecting your sleep? Is it overstimulating you? Is it decreasing physical activity? And then there's kind of like some of the ugly stuff on the internet that we're not really going to focus on today, but like things like high risk behaviors or the dark web or addictive things or things like, gambling and other things or social networking risks, meeting people in person and stranger danger risks or cyberbullying, which are all kind of like really terrible things that could happen because of technology. So now I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Ayurvolta.
May I just jump in for 1 second before you start, Dr.
Sure.
Ayurvolta? I just want to remind anyone who has questions, if they would like to send them in, we will be checking the chat and answering questions. This is amazing information that you're presenting today, and I just wanted to be sure to remind people who are watching. Thank you so much, Dr. Ayurvolta.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. I'm going to focus a little more in depth on social media, and especially in the adolescent population. So I was sort of like, well, how do we define social media? And so this is the online, I Googled it, right? We go online, we're talking about all of these forms of interacting online. And it's forms of electronic communication. So the social media component of all screens is really where you're communicating in some kind of social way with other people. So when we think about the term social media, most of us will think about something like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. But there are lots of ways in which any screen time that children and adolescents might be engaged with can include that social communication piece. A lot of our kids who like those online video games are playing video games, but they're also communicating with their peers. If they're streaming services, I had a young adult patient recently who was teaching me about how they could log on to their Disney Plus account and connect with their girlfriend who was home and was watching their Disney Plus account, and they could like communicate through Disney Plus and watch the same movie at the same time. So there can be social media connection in lots of these different kinds of, basically anything that they can produce online. So I'm a neuropsychologist here at Connecticut Children's, which means I'm really into brains and how brains grow and develop. And so what I want to sort of focus on, especially the sort of impact of social media, is those nice bright red frontal lobes in this beautiful picture of the brain, right? Brains we sort of think about development as sort of from the bottom to the top and the back to the front. The red part are your frontal lobes. And that's the part of the brain that's sort of the last to develop. So by the time we hit adolescence, we've got a lot of power. Our brain has a lot of skills, and we're really starting to focus on how do I make decisions? How do I problem solve? How do I really expand my organizational and working memory skills? And so that's the part of the brain that we're really thinking about in terms of development, when we're also really increasing the time on screens and specifically with social media. We also want to think developmentally. Even though I'm not a developmental pediatrician, we as psychologists spend a lot of time thinking about development too. And what are adolescents doing? What are they doing developmentally? And what are we thinking? How are their cognitive development going? And so some of the really main goals in adolescence for development is they're really building those social relationship skills. Peers are very important. They're building those complex social relationships. They're starting to develop romantic relationships and figure all of that out. They're also working on their independence and individuation, and ultimately identity formation. Who am I? How do I want to be separate from my parents? How do I want to live in this world? And what direction do I want my life to go in? So they're working on all of that at the same time, like where I was talking about before with their cognitive development. We're really focusing on that abstract reasoning, abstract problem solving, really sort of expanding their executive functioning and attentional control to be able to use all of that power that they've learned over their childhood to use that in the world really effectively and efficiently. So when we think about how this social media can affect our adolescents and their emotional adjustment in the context of them developing their development overall and their cognitive development, there are really some pros to emotional adjustment that we can see that social media adds to our adolescent lives. We saw this particularly during the pandemic, right? I can't tell you how many conversations I had with families where it was like, I spent the last 2 years telling my teenager to get off social media, and then the pandemic hit. And now I was like, okay, go on social media because it's the only way you can talk to your friends, right? And so the conversation really shifted over the last couple of years, but it really provided that emotional support and that social connection that some of our adolescents needed when they were isolated and at home and doing online learning. As a psychologist, one of the coping strategies that we use all the time is distraction, right? If we can take our brain off the thing that is making us feel anxious or stressed or sad, and we put our thoughts onto something else, that can help change our emotion. And certainly social media can be a distraction, and there are certain circumstances in which it can really make you feel good. Dr. Ketter was talking earlier about his favorite videos that he likes to watch, right? And there can be things that we turn to that make us feel happy. And so it's a good coping strategy. There's actually been some research conducted through Connecticut Children's Center for Behavioral Health that found for teenage males, when they were playing video games with their friends, they actually had lower levels of anxiety. So it was a way that they were able to connect with their peers, and it actually lowered their anxiety. I have found this topic has also come up in certain different populations and certain communities that adolescents may not have access to. For example, several of the patients that I know in the LGBTQ community say, I've been able to find other people online, and that was one of my first steps in connecting and helping to form my identity and having people that I could talk to openly and share my thoughts and feelings with, as I then started to think about sharing all of this with my friends and family that I see every day. And it can even be supportive for our teens who are going through some kind of mental health issue. If they're feeling anxious or depressed, connecting with other teens who feel that way, or even accessing supports for some of these mental health issues, that can all happen in social media. There also, as we know, can be some cons for emotional adjustment. One of the pieces that I thought was really important was, and Dr. Ketter touched on this too, about how it can be a time suck, right? And so what we see is if you're spending more time on social media and more time on your screens, you're having less physical activity, and that can have some impact on your physical health overall, and especially your weight. What's interesting to me as a neuropsychologist is all of the research that they do about sort of holding on to your brain power, especially as you age, which might not be important for adolescents, but for those of us who are no longer young adults, we really care about how our brains are aging. And physical activity is one of the most important things you can do to maintain your brain health. So if our adolescents are spending more time on screens and more time sitting down somewhere, as opposed to engaging in some physical activity, that is going to have an impact on their long-term brain health. Especially for our adolescent females, too much time on social media can cause an increase in anxiety and depression symptoms. This can also be an avenue for bullying. Dr. Ketter was referring several times to his childhood. When we didn't have social media, if something happened at school, we went home and it wasn't happening anymore. We had a break from it, right? Now that bullying can happen 24/7. It can interrupt your sleep. Something can start at school and continue on and expand online to include more people saying things. It can contribute to thoughts of feeling socially excluded from your peers because you go online and you see, oh, look at all of these friends. They all got together and I wasn't involved. And so that social isolation that you might feel can be exacerbated. And then depending on what the content is, if we're not on content that's making us feel happy and content that's good for us, and it's more focused on appearance-related topics, it can really increase our adolescents' vulnerability to body image issues and ultimately disordered eating. So we wanted to sort of transition to talk about how do we navigate social media, and then Dr. Ketter will end with how do we navigate screen time more generally. He was referencing before, we really want to think about I think as a parent of a young child, we work on stranger danger, right? What's safe? What does safety mean? Who's safe to talk to? Who's not safe to talk to? We have to do those exact same things for kids and teenagers when we're talking about social media. Who are you talking to? How do you protect your own privacy? How do you know what, like specifically what's out there? What of your information is out there? And how do we control that? How do parents control what information their kids have access to and what they can block? And this is a skill, right? We teach our kids how to get along with their brother or sister. We teach our children how to read. And now we have to also teach our children, how do we manage social media appropriately and safely? The other important piece to this, and I have to say, I know several teenagers where this has come up, and I'm always really proud of the teenagers that I know, where if this is sometimes online is the avenue where teenagers start to tell each other, I'm not feeling so good. I'm having really negative thoughts, and helping them learn, how do you recognize that in a friend? How do you know if they're just sort of saying something, or what words would you want to take seriously? And then when you hear those things, who do you tell and how do you tell them? And then what do we do with that, right? So if somebody is having a hard time and they're expressing that online, which happens pretty frequently. Clinically, I know that, and we see that in some of our data. This is another skill. We have to teach our teenagers how to be responsible and how to support their peers and speak up. So I wanted to also transition into some specifically helpful tips for social media use. In all things, I feel like I talk about this all the time with the families that I work with, where moderation is really a key, right? Dr. Ketter said it, this is here to stay. Social media is not going away. So we have to learn, how do we use social media and find some balance, find that point where we feel like we're really moderating how much we're using and when we're using it. As adults, we can set a good example. We don't have your phone out while talking to your kids, or we don't when you're doing a specific thing. We have a rule in my family that we don't take the phones out or any devices during dinner time. And both my husband and I have been put on timeout when we have broken this rule. So we have clearly set these rules in place. We set a precedent for social media use early. We have started talking about this in my home. What does it mean to be able to use these devices? How long do we use them? How do I know you need a break? And it's especially important to think about certain times of the day. As I'm really focused on brain sleep, besides physical exercise, sleep is so important to our overall brain health and to our brain function. And so we really want to think about bedtime and having a schedule and limiting our screen time. These, our devices and that social media can be popping at you all day and all night, and that can really interfere with having good sleep. So maintaining that consistent sleep routine, sort of switching to something that is less stimulating right before you go to bed. And the last piece on this slide is just knowing your child or your teenager, right? If you're a parent, you are the person who knows them best. There are some kids and teenagers who can regulate this themselves. They can say, you know what, I've been playing this for a while. I feel tired, or I'm starting to feel grouchy. I'm going to go do something else. Or I just have other activities that I really like. So, on a snow day, I'm going to spend a little more time on screens. But man, when that weather starts to turn, I am outside playing and I can't wait to get outside with my friends. But other kids and teenagers need more structure and more support from the adults around them in terms of setting those limits, having specific times of the day or amounts of time that they use any kind of social media. And in addition to moderation, my other sort of hallmark of many topics that I discuss is communication, right? So communication is really essential. We need to be talking to our kids and our teenagers about social media. What are they doing on there, right? Dr. Ketter showed us a slide how parents don't really know what our adolescents are doing. So we need to look. We need to be on those apps with them. Have them show you the content that they're looking at. Talk about what's happening and how they feel when they're looking at certain things. What do they like? What do they like that their friends are doing or posting? What makes them feel uncomfortable? Is there anything that makes them feel sad or worried? talking about how do we decide what we're going to post. So for most of my adolescent patients, my general rule is if you don't want your grandmother to see it, you shouldn't post it, right? It's a nice, easy decision about who's going to see this, because once it's out there, and I know certain programs, certain social media say it's only there for a little bit, but really once it's out there, it is out there, right? And this could potentially follow you down the road when you are applying for a job. So thinking about how do we decide, and actually talking about, well, what do you want to post and why would you post that? And how do you think people will react to it? Those are all important conversations. And watching your child or your teenager for warning signs. So if they look like they're sort of changing in their behavior and they seem pretty negative when they get off something, either a video game or some kind of social media. If they seem more sad, more angry, if they start to withdraw and they're spending more time in their room, if you see changes in grades or they're refusing to do something with a friend, or if they start to say, I don't want to go to school anymore, that's another time to be communicating. Is there something going on? And not only could it be going on at home or at school, but is there something going on online? Is something happening with an app you're using, or somebody saying something inappropriate to you or doing something inappropriate with you online? So these are all things that we can be talking about pretty frequently with our kids and our teenagers. And now Rob's going to jump back into how to navigate sort of screen time more generally.
So thank you, Lauren. It's really important that we think of social media like all kinds of screen time. And what's really important is that we develop some clear strategies ahead of time. So having clear expectations for kids for how we use media and other behaviors, kind of like Lauren mentioned, like rules for dinner time. We want to remember and reinforce the concept that media use is a privilege and that it's kind of a behavioral contract. Why? Because devices are things that are granted and given as permission. Like if kids are getting access to smartphones younger and younger, that's a real privilege. To do things like drive a car, which have high impact, potential physical dangerous things to happen, you have to have a license. But in order to have a phone, you don't need to have a piece of plastic that approves you in order to use it, right? It's something that a parent is granting, and some parents do it at different ages. But we want to think about clear expectations for what that might look like. So, whether it's like a gaming console or a laptop that you're sharing at home, what are expectations for things like homework and chores? And then like what happens if you exceed your designated use time? Does it go to cell phone jail? Does it mean loss of privileges, or how does that look? And then remember too that media is very motivating. When we look at the research behind things like cyberbullying, it's hard because sometimes a parent's gut instinct is like, nope, take away the social media. But that's actually part of the reason why kids don't like to talk about being cyberbullied, because they want access to social media, even though that it's part of the challenging thing, because social media is capital. It helps you stay in touch and know what's going on. So it's very motivating. So how do we teach it to be a good reinforcer and use it? And as Dr. Ayurvolta has mentioned a couple of times, right, all things in moderation. So pay attention to other things like, what does your child like content-wise? Are they going to be using it more for games? Are they going to be using it more for paying attention to what's trending or chatting with friends? I've seen children as young as 8 do online shopping, like during clinical visits. So like, things are out there and kids browse them and they come across them. So that's important. What do they like content-wise? Where and when are you using media? Do you have access to a mobile device? And really a big question that's different, right? Why isn't there one age where we would recommend a mobile device? Is because it's different for each person and child. So we have to ask, like, are you ready? Are you showing enough responsibility? It's not that you have to take a driver's ed course and get your license in order to do it, but you should show that you're trustworthy in order to do it. And then really inviting parents, because technology grows really quick and it is hard to keep up. Are you familiar with the parental controls on each device? Do you know how to set up blocking features if kids are being mean or intolerable online? Do you know how to use geolocation features and to track whether or not they're being used? Like, do you know if you're going to post a photo and it's going to tell you exactly where you are? Do you know how to track where your teen is using their phone? Things like that. And then getting back to, as Dr. Ayurvolta mentioned, the important things like, are you exercising? Are you sleeping? And then really important, how's your wallet, right? Because remember that a lot of the function of this is, yes, all of these companies are there to put out the service or product of us being able to connect with one another, but it is driven at the cost of ad revenue. So there's always a subtle message of the hidden algorithm or advertisements that are being given to you. And those work because they influence our decision-making capacities on a subconscious level. And ultimately, you have to ask, are you getting what you want out of it? So, we'll come back to that in a second as a question. But if you're wondering, like, how do I think about setting controls with my children? Healthychildren.org, which is the public-facing website from the American Academy of Pediatrics, has some really awesome tools for how to put together a family media plan. And the way it starts is you calculate based on your child's age. You start with how much sleep do they need in a day, and then you can calculate how much screen time you have available. Once you calculate how much sleep do you need, how much time do you need for homework, school, chores, etc., and then it cuts down to like what your available slot is. You can also set up rules for like where and when you use media. So this is a QR code. It takes you there if you have your phone. It is not a Super Bowl ad, I promise that. So that's a helpful tool that I use with a lot of my families in clinic. Another tool that I love is another nonprofit website called Commonsensemedia.org. It's a really awesome tool because it has everything for like the parent's guide to Minecraft, the parent's guide to Facebook and Instagram, the parent's guide to how to set up safety controls. But it also lets you look up like any show, game, or movie, and you can put in like Super Mario Brothers and come up with what age it thinks it's appropriate for, or like the new Lord of the Rings series on Amazon. You can look at that and see what experts think about what age it's appropriate for, if there's a lot of commercialist messaging in it, or positive messaging or negative messaging. So it's really nice. And then if you're ever trying to figure out is a website helpful or not, just remember .org means .organization. So that's a nonprofit site. In order to get a .org domain name, and .com comes from the word commercial, which means that it's a business site. So if you're a kid and you're trying to figure out like, where am I getting my information from? What does this mean? If it's a .org, they're not there immediately to focus on taking money. Yes, they probably want donations to stay alive as a nonprofit, but it's not the same purpose as a commercial website, which is clearly there for profit and gain. And then this is like my most important thing to think about, right? Why media? We're using it, yes, but how do we be more mindful? So how do we talk with each other about what we're getting out of it? How do we teach kids to set timers or limits, right? If a game's designed to suck you in, I always tell teens, like, put a timer, because before you know it, right, games are designed so that if you start on like a Saturday morning, you're like, where did the sun go? Where did the whole day go? What happened? I needed to collect all the things, right, in the game because it was designed that way. But we can also ask, are we emotionally getting what we want out of it? Is it helping us go like, ooh, I love games or social media, and I'm finding it to be nice and relaxing, right? Where you're like, zen, this is actually a cool game where you can like hang out with fish, right? Nice and relaxing. Or is it a game that's like making you feel angry? And, I work with kids who might self-identify as rage quitters, where you're like, buddy, why are you playing this? And they're like, to relax. And you're like, do you really think that it's relaxing? And they're like, yes, but that's not them talking. That's the hooks of a game that's designed to keep you there, right? And when we think about all other substances that could be addicting, like liquids or things that you use, we have laws in place that say you can't do them until you're 18 or 21, respectively. But we know that media hits that same pleasure circuit early on. So how are we thoughtful about creating tolerance and appropriate use in teaching that? And then when it comes to social media, it's not just this, right? Does it get you angry, but does it create FOMO or fear of missing out, right? If you're logging on to Facebook or Instagram because you're trying to see everybody's version of their best life and they're posting all their vacation photos, and you're stuck at home going like, why don't I get to go to Hawaii? Why don't I get to go and hang out with cool cars, right? Maybe ask yourself, are you getting what you want out of it? Because remember that that's still all an illusion of how people are projecting the best reality. So we always want to talk, and the best way to handle any of these is to have conversations about it. Talk about it with your friends, talk about it with your family, right? Because then we can talk about what are the hidden hooks, what are the hidden connections, and how are we learning how to deal with that? So thank you all so much. If you want more information from us at Connecticut Children's, both Dr. Ira Volta and I are blog content contributors. So like, yay, we're content creators. But you can come check us out on our hospital blog, where we have all kinds of articles for things like how to deal with peer pressure, or how to navigate bullying, or how to go back to school or process emotions. So that is there for you. But thank you so much for having us.
Oh, thank you so much. I mean, I was sitting here taking notes because, and I know I can get this information, but it was really valuable. I really appreciate the presentation and the focus, as we've been talking a lot about mental health and all of the information that we're learning, that we know it has been here, but there's been a real emphasis on it throughout the pandemic. There's so many areas to look at. And I love this presentation because oftentimes as parents, we're worried because we don't know a lot of times how to best navigate this. And I think of my own example. My youngest son is 8 and 10 years younger than my older two. And I have seen that chart that you showed at the beginning that kind of shows the change over time. It was a rapid change. You can really see it. And I think I would have been on it a little bit more with the older two, but the younger one, I didn't expect things to happen so quickly. And I always did Caillou was probably a better choice, but he did have a lot of tantrums. But other than that, over SpongeBob. So now I think it's a perfect time to segue into a conversation with Jack, Kiara, and Alicia, and really, kind of get your point of view, because I think you probably saw technology, social media start in one place, and then it is where it is today. And I think that it was a wonderful conversation, or very informative to hear, how there's some real bonuses because of the pandemic having social media, but also I think, how do you really balance all of this device in your time? How do you balance that? So I don't know who would like to start off with the conversation. Alicia, do you want me to start with you, and then you all can just kind of jump in, and we'd love to hear your insights, and we'll ask you a couple of questions, unless you get on a roll.
Sure, so I can start. I'm sure Jack and Kiara can relate to this, but we're in our early 20s. So for me, especially like social media, I wasn't as involved with it until I got like my first phone in freshman year of high school. So for me, it came on a lot later. So I had a lot more of those face-to-face connections with kids my age for a majority of my childhood. And when social media started for me, it was more so a way to connect with other people, post photos. And now I feel like it's a lot more setting beauty standards and a lot more pointless scrolling. And like how I said in the presentation, you have to think about what you are getting out of it. I know a lot of the time, like I'll be sitting at night, very tired, I'll still go on TikTok and scroll, and it's pointless. It takes up a lot of time. And then that affects my sleeping patterns because suddenly I can't sleep anymore because I was online for so long. So yeah, there's a lot of pros and cons. You do get to connect with other people. It's good for school, for forming connections, future job prospects as well. But at the same time, you have to think about how it's affecting your mental health, body image. So yeah, I'm sure Kiara and Jack can relate to that as well.
Kiara or Jack?
Yeah, I could go. I agree with everything Alicia said. So like a lot of the pros are pretty obvious in terms of like connecting with other people, but I too got my first phone, I think like well into high school. So I feel fortunate enough to have like developed in my early childhood away from social media, because I see a lot now. I've done like volunteer work with like 3-4-year-old children, and I see how they're so glued to like their tablets and things they do to like help them, get throughout the day. It's not as much as like interacting with their peers as it is with like interacting with their like devices or stuff like that. And I think even with like kind of older kids, like teenagers or people a little bit younger than me or even my age, social media now is a lot more of influencers, at least from my point of view, promoting like the highlights of their life, or promoting themselves looking their best, or photoshopping their photos, videos to make them look a certain way, or even like non-disclosing their like cosmetic procedures. And it makes a lot of people think they need to look a certain way or live a certain way. And it kind of just takes away from like the reality of, being human. It's not like they're promoting unattainable standards. So it really does have kind of a negative mental impact in that sense. Yeah, so like that's been my kind of like experience with it.
Yeah. And, it's interesting you say that. I was recently the airport, and happened to see the person sitting in front of me had a photo of herself, and she must have spent, I don't know, 20, 30 minutes getting rid of a lot of who I saw sitting in that chair. And by the time we were done looking at the image, I was like, how does this work? You don't look a thing like what you're posting. So when you meet people, I'm sure that's quite surprising, but that's a whole different generation, not something that I can relate to, but it does make me question, how do you feel about yourself, and always having to make those adjustments, what that means, to people as they do that. But Jack, I'd love your insight.
So I would agree with everything that everyone said. They received their phones a little bit later. I actually received my first phone when I was in 6th grade. And then my where I went to school through 7th through 12th grade, we were required to bring our laptops into school to work on educational stuff, when in reality, people were doing other things, texting, using social media when they shouldn't have, which can really have a hard mental health impact on everyone when you're in school, when you're supposed to be learning and you're just scrolling through Instagram or on Snapchat. A little bit later, TikTok. But I think social media has the ability to have a positive impact, especially when we were in the pandemic, when we couldn't see anyone face to face and we were communicating all through social media. And I think that has positive impacts. I would say that everything has shifted since the pandemic started. There's good and bad with everything. I would say towards about a couple months into the pandemic, it was harder with sort of blurring the lines between when you were setting a schedule as to when you should be on social media and when you should be using devices versus when you should be trying to do something else outside of technology. And that took me a little bit longer to learn. But overall, I would honestly say that social media definitely has its benefits, but it definitely has its disadvantages as well.
One of the things I was curious about, and thank you for that, is around the attention pieces. So both Dr. Ketter and Dr. Volta and everyone really. I mean, are we seeing differences in the ability to attend because of all of this? I mean, throughout, it feels like it would be everywhere. I notice, I can notice with myself, and I really do not do a deep dive into social media like I think a lot of people do. What are you seeing around that piece, the impact?
Do you want to go, Rob, or you want me to?
Oh, please start, neuropsychology colleague.
So our attentional skills start early, right? We start seeing those develop in early childhood, and it just develops and builds over time. Your question reminded me, I have this all the time. My child can't have ADHD. They focus on video games for hours at a time, right? And I'm sure that Dr. Ketter has heard that too. But the problem with all of these devices and video games and social media is that things are sort of just constantly changing and very intense. And so it doesn't give our brains time to really focus in on something and pay attention for a period of time and just calmly watch something. I think Dr. Ketter highlighted one of the studies during his talk about the differences between if you're doing some calm activity like coloring, right, where it gives you a chance to focus on what you're doing, to be creative, to think about things, versus watching something like SpongeBob where it's like always sort of binging at you, right? It just doesn't give your brain the ability to develop those skills. And I certainly think we see that over time, that we just aren't allowing our kids' brains to develop those skills in the same way that they did before they had access to all of this technology.
Yeah, having that ability in time, there's also a shift on kind of how we process stuff, because a lot of skills with the brain can be use or lose, right? And we change and shift all of the time. So, there have been some studies that have suggested that, boiling things down to something small that you can scroll through is changing the way that we're reading things, as opposed to sitting and reading and turning a page or being mindfully present. And this is an informal thing, but I would ask all of us to reflect on, right? For those of us who remember life pre-mobile devices, like, when was the last time you could sit and watch a movie and be present for the movie, right? A whole 90 minutes. I'm talking like 1990s movie, not like Marvel blockbuster that's 2.5 hours, right? But just think about it now with things like YouTube and now even TikTok. Like, when's the last time you could sit through a half-hour TV show without pulling up your phone. So we're multitasking a lot more, and these devices are competing with us in ways that it affects our relationships with interpersonal, it affects our parenting, it affects how we talk with our friends, it affects how our brains are focused and thinking about things. If they're trying to multitask and think like, "Ooh, did I get the thing, or did I check my feed? What does so and so think? Did I get enough likes?" and stuff like that.
Well,
I
you know,
also think, sorry, I just
yeah.
also wanted to say, when I put my sort of general clinical psychologist hat on, I also think it really impacts our ability to develop natural coping skills, right? And so that the long-term impact of mental health over time, because kids don't have a chance to be in emotion. It's okay to be angry or frustrated or sad. And how do we deal with that? Right. But if every time we have a strong emotion, we just go on a device, we're not really teaching ourselves how do we cope with things. And so then at some point we hit something that's hard in life, and we can't just go on a device, and we don't have those skills in place to be able to deal with those things and help ourselves and help our emotion regulation.
And,
that's a really good point. That's a really good point. Go ahead, Dr. Ketter.
Oh, sure. And not just coping, but like one of the hardest things for childhood now is boredom, because there's so much stuff that it's actually hard to be bored because you can always find something.
Yeah.
But this is a change, right? Like we could wait in line at the grocery store and just like think through our day, or like, oh, think of like, you know, the song that's like an earworm in your head, like, oh, let's not talk about Bruno. Okay, I'm enjoying that. Instead of like actively having to pull out your phone and like, let me check an email, let me check my post, let me check things, right? So being bored is actually the challenge of childhood and adolescence, and even for us as adults now. How do we find that moment to be mindful and still? Because everything else is competing to get into that time.
Yeah, so it makes me just wonder with, you know, Jack and Kara and Alicia, how you create those boundaries. I mean, if you're able to do so, and some strategies that you may use for that, and just to kind of rest your brain, rest your mind some literally from all of this that comes in.
Sure, I'll go. So I would say that's especially, it took me a long time to do it, but it was especially hard when I was doing academic work. So I would find myself wanting to work on a paper or something, and I'd see a notification on my phone and I'd immediately want to go check it, or an email come in and immediately want to respond to that. I found that over, at least through the pandemic and over through my college experience, I found that the only way that I can really fully like put my attention towards something is by turning off my phone completely. And then I give the attention to the assignment that I'm working on at hand, putting do not disturb on my laptop, because now text messages go to your laptop, at least for me. So it's very hard to stay, it's very easy to stay connected and very hard to stay disconnected. So I found turning on do not disturb, not checking it, turning off my phone has really helped me to sort of be able to focus all of my energy on one thing as opposed to multitasking.
Very good, very good. Do you have any strategies, Kara or Alicia?
Yeah, I agree with Jack. I think, especially when I'm working on schoolwork, if my phone is there, even if there's no notifications, I'm still looking at it, I'm still scrolling through, still checking, even though there's nothing there, because it is kind of like an addiction. And I also like to turn my phone off. I think, especially for me, I like to delete apps completely when I'm working on something, or just put my phone away where I can't see it, because I will gravitate towards it. And yeah, it is kind of like an addiction.
Alicia?
I was going to say the same thing. I agree with both. I usually just, if I'm ever working on something, I just put my phone away completely, like maybe in another room, because I feel that every time I get bored, like every couple minutes, I'll just pick up my phone and go on TikTok and just scroll. And it is like, it's an instant like reward factor, just moving on to the next video. So you really have to like tell yourself to get off the app. It's never going to like end. The videos are going to keep going. You know, it's, again, like it is very addicting. So I definitely have to like isolate myself from my phone.
So, I mean, so they're young adults, which is wonderful, because I think they have the benefit of, you know, sixth grade or high school. But what happens if you're a parent in the thick of it? You have a teenager who came along and this kind of got out of hand before you realized it. And so now what do we do? Because I do think you can see some of the withdrawal. You can see them tired, you know, irritable, and not necessarily putting the best performance into schoolwork and things like that, because the focus is, I really want to get back on this device. what would be some recommendations you could give us? I know you've given us a lot of great ones, but if you're in the thick of it right now, anything?
Sure. I would like to really highlight what Dr. Ayurvolta said earlier, which is developing healthy coping skills and mechanisms. I work a lot with young children, and the most dangerous thing that you can do with a mobile device is use it as a way to become a digital pacifier for if you're having a tantrum or you're frustrated over some normal life stressor where it's like you didn't get the toy you wanted or you're bored at a restaurant, right? The most dangerous thing that we can do is, instead of teaching how to deal and cope with those normal life stressors, is to use this as an avoidance tool or as a maladaptive coping skill. So setting limits early on is really important because teaching how to be safe with behavior, it starts long before the time you get a phone.
Absolutely.
And I would say, just if you are, as you said, in the thick of it, like you sort of maybe missed some things, and with the pandemic going on, and they've been on their devices more. I can say that as a parent, right? Like more screen time than I ever thought I would allow, because we're living in the midst of a pandemic. And I had to do telehealth visits at home for a little while. Right? So I think if you're in the thick of it, you have to, is there a small place to start? So we can't overhaul everything all at once, right? So is there a small place to start? Is it that we start with, I brought this up because it's, sleep is so important. Can we start with bedtime and sort of taking the device out of the room during the night? Can we start with a limitation, like I said, at dinner time? Or can you start with a limitation of like, this is your homework hour, and so you can only, we're going to put the devices away with the exception of a laptop if that's what you're doing your work on, because that's the reality of things right now. But can we sort of just focus on this right now? So can you start small? Is there somewhere you can start to make a change and then build on that? Okay, now we've fixed bedtime. Now we'll move to the next portion of this and sort of grow it over time to get it back under control.
Very good. I think that's really good advice. And the last thing, I hate the time is gone because this has been such an interesting discussion for me. But I just wonder, long term, does this change the mind? Is this something that is the brain just going to become a bit different in the way we adapt moving forward? It just feels that if we don't cope as much, our attention span is shorter. Like, what is the long-term impact of this expected to be? Or do you know at this point? I know there's probably a lot of ongoing research.
I think there are a lot of unknown questions, right? There's still a lot to be seen. The other piece of that is that the more we study the brain, we know it can grow and change over the lifetime, right? We used to have this idea years ago that once you hit a certain age, your brain stopped growing and developing. And in fact, that's not true. And I think there's lots of ways that our brains can adapt to things. So I think we'll continue to learn that over time. I think it'll be, it's really interesting. There's some research about sort of memory and how much our young adults are trying to build in their memories, and they're maybe not paying attention to the details as much because what they know is I can go get this information. Right. So they may not recall as much, but they know I have access to it. But that might be an adaptive way to use your brain, right? You may not need to store as much information because there's so much more out there, but you need to be really adept at gaining information and knowing how to get good information. So I think that's a question we'll continue to ask, and we'll just learn over time.
I do have a question that I want to get to that came up that says, how do we know the differences caused by technology in the brain, i.e. multitasking, et cetera, are negative in the future? This is kind of what we brought up speaking about. Hypothetically, if you are able to teach your children how to manage emotions, work through boredom, read more, develop healthy coping skills, et cetera, outside of technology use, how do we know that the future doesn't need brains to adapt to that type of fast-paced processing? Kind of a spin on it.
That's an excellent question. And if you can do all of those things as a parent, I want to meet you and shake your hand and take notes, because that is it's a lot easier said than done, especially in the thick of the moment. I think that if we can do all of that, amazing, right? Our intelligence is evolving as a species, but we also have to remember that sometimes we see negative effects of when technology moves quicker then we can. And we can look at that with like how we have human diets, right? The human body wasn't super created to have access to sugar 24/7. And as a result, we see problems with things like obesity and diabetes and other issues. Could there be an emotional behavioral equivalent of like, right, diabetes of the mind, so to speak, or obesity of the mind? Because that's why I like that analogy of you are what you eat. If your content that you consume helps you to be an adapted, well integrated human being who's able to have healthy, positive relationships and a healthy work-life balance, then that's awesome. Go for it. But, you know, as human beings, we're wired to have feelings, we're wired to have emotions. We're also wired, as we do see from some studies, that when things get too fast-paced all the time, living on that adrenaline circuit has its pluses and minuses. So how do we balance that? So this is all a question of balance. And that's why it comes back to, are we getting what we want out of it? And we have to keep asking ourselves that, which is a very like meta human society question. And that is not a plug for certain social media companies. But right, we want to think about how are we using this? Because if we keep our mindfulness, then we're in the driver's seat. If we don't keep our mindfulness, then we're in the passenger seat, or we're being pulled along for a ride that we don't know where that destination is.
And I just want to add, you know, I think the person who has the question asked the question has a really good point. As a parent, you know, you have to find that balance and moderation, like I was talking about. And I feel like my child has to have access to technology because this is a life skill. You know, she's going to grow up in a world where this is just what everybody knows how to do. And if it's a skill she doesn't have, that could be a disadvantage, right? So how do I balance and include all of those things? And some days we might do that better than other days, but how do I teach her all of the things about devices and screens and social media, as well as these other things? Because I think it's true. It's going to be a part of everyone's life.
Right. And thank goodness for it. As you said in the opening, you know, for school, we weren't expecting this. For telehealth, I mean, we've had to use our devices and to socialize when we couldn't do it in other ways. So, you know, like most things, moderation is key. It's a critical part of it. Well, I tell you, I really appreciate this discussion this evening and really giving us some insight into how to work this, how to balance this. I have some really good information here that I'll be relying on. And I just want to thank all of you for your participation this evening. We will continue to have a series in 2 weeks. We will have a panel of young people that we will be having a discussion around young people and mental health, and have a discussion around that I think will be very interesting. So we'll continue the series for the next month or so. But until then, thank you so much for your time and participation, and take care and be well. Thank you.